of unrest following the murder of George Floyd, the Madison Police Department asked the Quatron Center to review how it handled these protests. Today we'll hear about the report from Madison Police Chief Sean Barnes and John Holloway with the Quatron Center. Both will say a few statements and then we will take questions from everyone. Chief?
Everybody doing? Before I get started, good afternoon. 2020 was a year filled with unprecedented challenges, a global pandemic, civil unrest resulting from the senseless murder of George Floyd, increasing levels of gun violence. Police departments across the country had their community trust and legitimacy immediately tested. In keeping with MPD's core value of continuous improvement, MPD sought to answer one important question: how can we improve? In 2017, the ORI report from the Madison Police Department Policy and Procedure Review Ad Hoc Committee recommended that MPD participate in a Sentinel event review conducted by the Quatron Center, an affiliate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School. The intent of the Sentinel event review is to identify factors that lead to an undesirable outcome, also known as a root cause analysis. After securing grant funding in 2019, MPD began working with the Quatron Center to identify an event to review. While another event was initially selected, MPD requested that the Quatron Center instead review the department's response to civil unrest which occurred throughout the summer of 2020. Ultimately, the process was applied to a total of 6 days of MPD's significant response to that unrest. The report is a full and transparent review of police responses to protests that occurred in 2020. The report is a consensus report. The Quatron Center is a neutral evaluator with no friends to reward and no enemies to punish. The report contains 69 recommendations for improvement and implementation from a review of 14 critical incidents. It is my intention to implement each recommendation and present an accountability metric for our public. Each incident referenced in the report contained input from a diverse group of community stakeholders. I have reviewed the document, and some of the major themes include communication strategies, the importance of communicating before, during, and after a protest, training and tactics, things like mobile fixed lines, vehicles, command posts, and ICS training. The use of tear gas and other irritants must be reasonably and minimally applied. The decisions must be clearly explained, and appropriate use of force reports must be completed. Equipment needs, such as vans to transport police officers to areas where they are needed quickly. The use of amplification devices and body-worn cameras are a must for our department. Additional themes include staffing, community partnerships, trust and legitimacy, and healing. I would like to thank the men and women of the Madison Police Department for their dedication to this process, specifically Assistant Chief Paige Valenta, who led the process, along with Captain Matt Ty and retired Chief Vic Wall, who initiated this process. I would like to thank our community for their partnership in this effort to improve. And finally, I would like to thank and introduce Professor John Holloway for leading this project and invite him to the podium for comments and our portion.
Hi, I'm John Holloway. I'm the Executive Director of the Quatron Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. We specialize in sentinel event reviews of criminal justice events, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process that we went through to generate the report that was released today. I want to start by acknowledging that while the sentinel event review process, the root cause analysis process that we used is relatively new to criminal justice. It has been used for decades in the transportation and healthcare areas. These are industries and complex systems of human interaction that have worked hard on continuous quality improvement. In the criminal justice system, we often look back at who should be blamed for something, but we rarely take the additional obligation of forward-looking accountability to learn from an event that had an outcome that nobody wanted, and to learn from that event and prevent the next error from happening. And so when Chief Wall called the Quatron Center and said, the Madison Police Department would like to participate in a Sentinel event review because obviously the protests that happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd did not have the outcomes that any of us would have wanted. It was a rare opportunity for the Quatron Center and a major police department to work together to learn from these complex protests. The Madison Police Department volunteered for this. They were incredibly transparent in participation. They provided over 1,600 documents for us to review, over 625 hours of video, over 30 hours of audio, and we interviewed over 50 officers who participated in various moments of the protests to really understand what happened, not just what happened at a granular level, but why people acted the way they did, both from the protester perspective and from the law enforcement perspective, and to try and identify all of the various factors that came together to turn what began as peaceful protests into more chaotic scenes with uses of force, violence, injuries both to police and to protesters, and property damage throughout Madison. As you can imagine, it was a fairly substantial challenge to try to take 90 days of protests and reduce them into useful, granular recommendations that Chief Barnes and his team can actually implement. What our stakeholder group, which consisted of multiple and diverse perspectives from the community, combined with representatives from both the Madison Police Department and other law enforcement agencies that participated in the protests on those days, our group analyzed that information and brought to the stakeholder group a list of potential, what we called critical incidents. So particular moments within the protest that the community felt were flashpoints or particularly undesired outcomes or situations that both community and police were confronted with. We ultimately identified 14 of those in 3 main chunks of the protest. So we started with the first weekend going from May 30th through to June 2nd and had a section of critical events there. We looked at protests that happened on June 24th and 25th in the wake of an arrest of a community activist, and we looked at protests that erupted in the aftermath of the shooting of Jacob Blake, which obviously is back in the news even as I speak. From those assessments, the process that we went through was for the Quatron Center to facilitate a conversation, provide detailed video, audio, other things of the events so that the stakeholders could evaluate them. We would then facilitate a conversation where the stakeholders commented on what they saw, what they reacted to, and these were people who both had worked to facilitate the protests from a law enforcement perspective and who had participated in the protests as activists and members of the community. And so we were able to blend those perspectives together and get a better understanding of how those interactions may have reinforced escalations of the protests into more violent altercations, rather than finding ways to de-escalate and manage the protests in the peaceful and safe way that everybody had hoped for at the start of the day. That process ultimately yielded 133 contributing factors across the 14 critical incidents, so I think you get a sense of the complexity of what we were trying to establish by just how many different factors we found that contributed to these events. And as the chief said, yielded 69 recommendations for improvement. I think it's important to acknowledge that opportunities for improvement are not the same thing as failure to do things professionally at the start. This is a quality improvement exercise, not a finger-pointing exercise. And as the chief said, the Madison method has been the envy of many departments across the country and something that has been emulated. The circumstances that were presented on March 30th when these protests began were a unique set of circumstances driven by histories of racial injustice and illegitimate policing, starting in this case in Minneapolis, not in Madison at all. And the department was faced with situations that they hadn't previously seen before. In that situation, it's normal to expect that not everything would go perfectly, and what the department has taken on here is the obligation to continue to improve, which I think is a noteworthy thing. We did not find any instances of explicit racism. We did not find moments where we felt that the department was acting wantonly, or some of the other scenes that seen in my city of Philadelphia and other cities around the country. This was a situation of a number of law enforcement professionals working very hard to give life to the Madison method, to facilitate these protests, and to manage a set of very dynamic and changing circumstances, and change and improve their tactics over the summer. And so we hope that the report will be a blueprint for further progress, and will help both Madison and the members of the community, Madison Police and members of the community, continue to have dialogue about how to facilitate safe and peaceful protests in this city, give life to the First Amendment, but make sure that all of the constituents of Madison are protected in that context. And so I guess with that, I will pause, and Chief, if you want to say anything else, you can probably.
Thank you, John. We certainly appreciate it. I know we have some one-on-one interviews, but we'll take a few questions.
I just want to make sure that I'm clear. So you guys, the department 4 years ago wanted to do this kind of review, and then last year, before it was scheduled to be done on a certain event, whose idea was to change it to the protests?
Assistant Chief Vic Wall, who was our interim chief at the time, we were going to review the Shake the Lake incident. I'm not sure what year that was, but that was the initial event, but we decided to look at the protest instead.
Can the person in front come down about 6 inches?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Chief, you said you'll implement all recommendations. In regards to body cameras, is that only for crowd events or all officers on every patrol?
Yeah, I've said since I've been here that I believe in body-worn cameras. I think it goes a long ways to establish trust and transparency with our public, and certainly I will certainly be working to ensure that our department explores body-worn cameras.
Chief, what is your obstacle to achieving that currently within city government?
Yep, so there's a process. Currently, we have to do a body-worn camera pilot. I have to go to city council and ask for permission to conduct that pilot, and I want to take it one step at a time. I think it is important and it is fair to conduct a pilot so we can determine what is appropriate, what's not appropriate for our community, and so that we can ensure our community that their concerns will be heard. So that's the first step. We'll complete that first step, and then we'll move towards to see how body-worn cameras can be implemented here in Madison. However, it's a process.
If needed, will you be joining the crew in Kenosha to help with the unrest there?
No, we have not been requested to go to Kenosha.
Of the 69 recommendations, what ones can you, as the head of the police department, implement right away, and what ones need, what portion of them need additional approvals, like the body cams need
Yeah.
approval from city council?
Yeah, I think body-worn cameras certainly is a recommendation. It's gonna take some work, but right now, we can improve our communication. We've been working with some of our community partners. The recommendation of having community dialogue representatives is something that our department explored last year, and we're further exploring that. But that's a partnership between the police department and those community members who want to see that everyone's safe. So that's an immediate recommendation that we are exploring.
So what proportion would you say are immediate ones versus ones that will take a little while?
Yeah, well, 69 of them, I don't have them all memorized at this particular time, but I can certainly get back with you. Thanks.
Professor Hallway, could you explain something in the report that Madison Police were unprepared for the scope and emotion of the first set of protests? And then Chief, if you would also respond.
Yeah, well, as I said, I mean, this is a pretty unique set of circumstances, and I think the days after George Floyd's murder, we saw this sort of acceleration of an emotional release throughout the country, not just in Madison, but really everywhere in the United States. And I think that the review that we did, particularly of May the 30th, showed the Madison police doing their best to prepare, looking at social media, trying to engage with people who had announced protests. And in the 24 hours prior, the social media changed, the number of people who announced they were coming to do protests rapidly grew, and the outpouring of emotion that was linked with George Floyd that has made it the cause that everybody has been following for all this time and all through the summer throughout the country, kind of all boiled over. Interestingly, on the 30th and on other days, what we saw was not widespread crowd violence, but rather small numbers, very small numbers, like single-digit numbers of people who were the sort of agitators and instigators of violence, in with a group of people who were already filled with emotion. Some of that emotion because of the actions of the police in Minneapolis, some of it because of histories that they may have had with the police, some of it because of COVID and the assorted, circumstances with that. So a lot of large factors sort of beyond anybody's control came together in what was a pretty unexpected way. And so, again, I think unprepared I would view as a statement of fact rather than a criticism. I think it would be very difficult, and we certainly saw in cities across the country protests that escalated to violence for which the departments, were sort of not expecting. So that's what we were trying to say in that situation.
Maybe, you were gonna answer, I'm sorry, Chief.
No, I would just add, I agree with everything you said. I'll also say, prior to 2020, there were a lot of things that we weren't prepared for. I didn't own the mask prior to 2020. The advent of social media and how quickly information can spread. The George Floyd incident certainly shocked the conscience of America. It certainly shocked the conscience of police officers who just want to come to work every day and do the best they can for their community. And so, just being prepared for it is tough. I know that in my police department where I was working in 2020, we only had crowd management training maybe once a year if we were lucky. That may not have been the case here. They're a little bit more prepared. They had set teams and things of that nature. But it was a situation that rapidly escalated. It's my understanding that the demonstrations were relatively peaceful up until one point, right? And so the department was prepared, but not prepared for all those things coming together, including the pandemic, quarantine, what people were feeling, the uncertainty, the anxiety, and then couple that with the fact that we saw someone get murdered on screen by a police officer. The trust and legitimacy, as I spoke of before, was truly tested by every police department in the country, not just Madison.
The list of participants in the report, I was represented urban leagues with some Black Lives groups, but I didn't see was like Freedom Inc., YGB, and some of those more activist organizations that were involved in the protest. Was there an effort to engage those folks, or did they say no, or how did that shake out?
No, there were multiple modes of inquiry for this particular case study, including a portal where any citizen could come on and give their input.
Chief, this gentleman said that the point of the study was to look forward as opposed to look back and point fingers. Is there any benefit or challenge for you, being someone who came in after all this happened and looking at the results of the study and at what happened?
Is there any benefit?
Like, because you're coming in after the fact, and you can see it without saying, "Oh, I was there that night." Do you have a different perspective of what happened or the results that were given to you?
No, I don't. I think the results are what they are. They were consensus recommendations, and whether I'm here or not, I'm still a trained police officer. And so obviously I have the opportunity to review the documents just like everyone else, and I certainly agree with them. I can probably insert the two police departments that I've been involved, and some of the same recommendations will be applicable. The only difference is those police departments did not reach out to the Quatron Center. The Madison Police Department did.
Chief, you mentioned body-worn cameras. You have heard from city leaders in the wake of what occurred during these protests, some city leaders with concerns about the use of OC spray, CS gas, and the report speaks to your department. It says you should avoid CS gas whenever possible. How do you act on that, or will you?
Yeah, everyone should avoid CS gas whenever possible. I agree with that statement 110%, but we have to understand that it's always something that we have to weigh, and that is the harm to human beings, the harm to life, the harm to property, sometimes the harm that community members may not see at the time that they're walking into a situation. And so if it is appropriate to use it to protect the lives of people, we will weigh that when the time comes. But we try not to use always and never when you're working with police or social sciences.
So what about just how much some of the new equipment and stuff will cost? Are you worried about giving that through the city budget process?
Well, the city budget process is what the city budget process is, right? If I worried about, every time I ask for money, I would not have any hair. But what I try to do is I try to do the right thing. I try to present an argument to our leaderships that's fair and that's balanced. And I allow the leaders to do their job, but I have to do mine as well. I think it's important to note early on just transportation needs, right? Being able to have officers who can get to scenes quickly, that only keeps people safe, but also keeps property safe as well. And so having the transportation needs to get there, whether it's vans or whether it's some other piece of equipment, is very important. And certainly, I will be looking at these recommendations along as well as my staff, and when the time comes, we'll make those appropriate asks.
There was one part of the report about the burning squad car. Was that, I just wanna make sure I'm right, so was it moved by somebody and that was a good thing just because it prevented other buildings from getting in fire? So some bystander did that?
Yeah, I think the person was trying to help us out a little bit by getting it out of the area. I'm not sure how effective that was, but certainly I think that probably was the idea.
And Mr. Hollywood, did I understand the report correctly that you went to the level in terms of tactics and what was available to police to loudspeakers or bullhorns? Were you basically saying that the Madison Police Department was not equipped with kind of standard devices such as those to try to preempt?
So I guess what I would say is the review suggested that the Madison Police Department was using squad PAs and bullhorns to try to communicate to the crowd at a moment where it was the largest crowd that anybody had seen in downtown Madison in decades. So there are other devices that can be used that have more audio capability and would allow for and facilitate communication that is audible to larger and larger crowds. So one of the recommendations is to enhance the ability of the department to communicate, now that we've seen what size crowd we might be confronted with, to be able to communicate with that crowd and to communicate in ways that helps the crowd understand that what the police are trying to do is facilitate and protect the protest, not thwart it or control it. Often the kind of legalese that gets recommended in protests makes things sound more authoritarian, whereas a more plain-spoken communication can convey the good faith desire of the police to keep everybody safe, and that's the reasons for the communication. So giving them both the tools and the methodology for that improved communication is at the root of those recommendations.
So instead of saying like this is an unlawful gathering, saying something less legalese?
Perhaps, or also explaining the rationale for why the police are about to do something, right? The police are about to go do X. We want you to understand that this is because there's a danger to the people in the crowd of this. So be prepared for us to come in and, we will be doing this in 5 minutes or something.
So
Giving people an
explaining that.
opportunity to leave the scene when that might be getting dangerous and providing that safety rationale as well.
So explaining that over the loudspeakers?
Yes,
So just in general, better communication, more clear communication.
I think that's always something that's a good thing.
I would think though, in a loud crowd that's screaming, they're not really listening to what's going on above them. They're just kind of part of everything that's going on around them. It's kind of hard to be the person saying, hey, we're gonna come in right now and do this and that create,
It may
amped up
be,
crowd.
but you have to try.
Yeah.
And then, with the use, also we spoke earlier of community dialogue representatives, being able to communicate with them, whether it's text or cell phone or in the crowd, kind of relaying that information. It's a team effort. It really
Yeah.
is communication. So,
Speaking of team effort, Steve, sorry, you have other agencies here, California National Guard, you have other sheriff departments that support. Is there any of this, are there any recommendations here that would help facilitate, I don't know how much command you have over those other folks who are here and how they would fit into these recommendations?
Well, we have a command center, and each agency that we partner with, we have a representative in that command center in order for to facilitate communication.
Professor, can you just describe, and maybe just broad strokes, the difference between the responses in June and the responses in August? Or the biggest differences that you found?
Between June and August, I think what we saw in the August incidents that we reviewed was some changing tactics from protesters that were, again, small groups of protesters that were being more aggressive about trying to start fires in buildings and that sort of thing. And we had seen the evolution of mobile set responses from MPD that kind of happened over the course of the summer. And so the mobile set response was actually a productive response when you have a small group of people that is leaving the protest and going to commit arson, for example, because it allows for a more rapid response to address just those people that are endangering lives in this instance, and deal with that without interfering with the larger, more peaceful protest that's going on. And so I think we saw that interplay work more effectively as we got into August. And then the other thing that we saw in August was the sort of first implementation of the community dialogue representatives. And so the opportunity, one of the things that we saw earlier in the protests was that the command post was really reliant on closed circuit TVs, which don't have audio and are obviously not in amongst the crowd, such that it's hard to really understand what the mood of a protest is, and you may not have a complete set of kind of information coming in to really help you navigate that situation. So with the community dialogue representatives, you have two great things. One is you have real-time contact with people in the crowd, which allows you to have a more nuanced understanding of what's going on and when there really is a need to intervene versus allowing things to continue to progress. But also you have trusted community representatives who provide some authority for self-policing, if you will, in that atmosphere. When the police are the subject of the protest, a demonstration of police force can become escalatory rather than calming. And so having the community be communicating with MPD in constructive ways and allowing the protest to continue is a way of showing support to the community that helps keep things calm. And so that was a very useful thing that we saw, and as you've seen in the recommendations, we made recommendations to try and continue to improve that practice.
We have time for two more questions. Elise, I know you had your hand up a few minutes ago.
Yeah, I just had a question about one of the paragraphs towards the beginning of the explanation of this mentioned that officers, and I just want you to explain how you came to this conclusion, but there was a claim made that officers were almost surprised at the fact that the protesters who showed up were not just angry about, I think you mentioned a couple situations, but it was almost like it was personal. It was this personal anger towards them, and that surprised them. So I just didn't know where you came to that conclusion, because I feel like that's a very bold claim to make.
Well, as I said, we interviewed more than 50 officers, so I think the perspective that was reflected by the officers was theirs, not ours. And I don't think it was a conclusion that we reached as much as information that was provided to us by some of the officers. I think one of the things that made this summer very challenging was that protesters in many cities would associate the acts of the Minneapolis Police Department to all police. And there were many instances where people in the crowd would say very disrespectful, very difficult to hear things to police officers, and in particular often to black police officers, about how they could wear the badge, how they could do the things that they do, were they traitors to their race. And this is, again, I'm not picking specifically from Madison, but from conversations we've had with law enforcement departments around the country. I think it's not terribly surprising if you're a Madison police officer here to facilitate a protest to have people accusing you of terrible things because of something the Minneapolis Police Department has done, to feel like maybe that's a little bit more personal than they would have expected at the start of the day.
Did that also come from some of those interviews that you did with the protesters or community members? You said there were like 180 of those too?
Well, I think you might be referring to the comments that came to the website as opposed to other interviews, but sure, the statements that we got from the protesters are all in the report verbatim that were submitted to the website, so those are all there for your review.
I was wondering about, so a lot of the report focused about focusing on the instigators rather than the whole crowd of people, and having MPD only come in when they really need to have an intervention, but what I saw on the ground was fights, people would get attacked and beaten up, kind of like that. It happens in an instant. How can you kind of keep people safe when those instances of violence happen so quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is trying to set the tone for those persons who may be agitators, right? And making sure that the officers can get there as quickly as possible. But it's really all about the tone of the demonstration, ensuring that it's peaceful, ensuring that if someone shows up and they decide that they don't want a peaceful protest, or that they want some type of altercation, being able to deal with that person and that person specifically. I think that's one of the things that I've heard personally from our community, from some people who may have thought that, you know, the response was unfair to those who came to just observe, and I've seen that before in my other organizations. And lastly, before we go, I wanted to just back up to your comment, and that was one of the things that we discussed. There were many things in the report that we talked about. You know, these protests, in my judgment, were about more than just George Floyd. You know, that certainly was the theme that brought everyone out, but police, we are the most visible form of government. And we're that form of government that has the ability to take away your freedom, and in some cases, take away your life. And people are frustrated by that. I think what you saw was just, in my judgment, was just a culmination of a lot. You know, people seeing government not really work for them. You know, people paying taxes and not seeing the benefit of what they think is important. The person who's not responsible for fixing that pothole in your street, and you break your you don't know that person when they pass you on the street, but you know who we are. And so, you know, I think it was just a mix of frustration with government in general, and we just happen to be the ones at the forefront of it. But that just means that we have a greater opportunity to rebuild trust and legitimacy in our community, and it begins, number one, with reconciliation, which is what we're trying to do now. Taking a look back at what we did and asking ourselves, how can we improve? Taking ownership of those things that we could have done better, and committing to doing better in the future. It also begins with proximity, making sure that we have a dialogue with our community members before, during, and after anything would happen. As you know, we're preparing or anticipating a verdict in the Rittenhouse trial, right? We've already reached out to members of our community to get their perspective about what a verdict could or could not mean for our community. That's very, very important. Making sure that we're proximate in our community before something happens. Because there were police departments around the country that didn't have 180 days of protest, and there were some that had double that, right? And so it begins with laying the groundwork. And the last thing, and most important thing, is making sure that we're comfortable making the changes that we need, and we can demonstrate to our community how we're making those changes. And we call that accountability here at the Madison Police Department.
Can I just ask one quick question about these mobile set teams? Just,
As they were done for now, but if you want to send it via email, we will happily put it back.